The Experience of Thinking. A series of talks on change of consciousness in the writings of European philosophers by John Thompson. Episode 11. Friedrich Nietzsche.
What does philosophy do? I'd like to propose that it reflects the human being, the way human beings see themselves, and how they see the world around us. That's what philosophy is trying to do. What is the human being? What is this world in which the human being is living? Now, until about the 17th century in Europe, theology, that's the study of the divine, was very close to philosophy. There was no philosophy without theology. And then in the 17th century, theology began to be criticized and separated from theology. The divine was no longer the focus for philosophers. They turned their attention elsewhere. And then, with the gradual advance of science, this has tended to replace the focus for philosophers from theology. So now we are living in a world where our thinking is very much dominated by the experiences of scientists and the technology that has arisen out of it. So what the old theology held together up to the 17th century has generally fallen apart. And we live in a time of a certain problematic. The problematic being that the attempt to understand what the human being is has been separated from our attempt to understand the world. They are different problems in some way. Not entirely separate, of course, but they are to some degree have fallen apart. If we look at this 20th century philosophy, I propose that there are basically two big streams that go through the century. The one I call the existential theme, and the other one I'll call the analytical stream. Now, the existential stream belongs to those philosophers who start essentially from trying to understand the human being. What is the human being? What is his task? What is his direction? How can he live in the world? And very often these philosophers connected with this existential stream are interested in literature, arts. Often some of them wrote drama, wrote novels, and that's what I call the existential stream, focusing on the question, what is it to be human? And the other stream I call it analytical. And the analytical has the focus in grounding one's thoughts on the experience of nature. I look out to the world and the stars and the planets and all the world, amazing world around us, and I try to say, how can we understand that? And what can we be sure of that we understand? What really is out there? So the focus is directed outward. And analysis, scientific research is very important for this kind of thinking. And also mathematics plays a big role. So these are the general descriptions of these two streams. Of course, they interpenetrate, but often surprisingly little. One of the great members of the existential stream, whom I call that, he didn't use the word, Martin Heidegger, had very little to say about one of the analytical stream, Bertrand Russell, and vice versa. They had little in common. They didn't really understand where the other one was coming from. So these are the two streams. Now, for us, it's not a question of choosing one or the other, but rather of trying to understand where these two streams are placing themselves and what are the assumptions that underlie them, which they often ignore. So that's one of the questions we'll try to look at. Now, I'm not pretending to make a history of 20th century philosophy. The people I've chosen belong mainly to the first half of the 20th century. I suppose that's got to do with my age and the time when I was educated and met these figures, and I feel more connected with them than those who've appeared in more recent times. It's difficult also to judge more recent philosophers on actually what is their stature. You have to survive some time before we know how big you are. And so for that reason, I confine myself to 7 or 8 philosophers who mainly lived and worked through the first 50, 60 years of the 20th century. That's a personal preference, and it's got no implication of others are not up to it or anything like that. I never studied philosophy, so I'm, in that sense, not an academic at all, but I was very impressed with philosophy when I was at university, where I studied law. And there was a professor, John McMurray, and his lecture rooms were always filled with people wanting to hear his moral philosophy. And he was, for me, quite a unique personality. His approach to philosophy was what I would call a transformational, developmental way. He looked at how society is today, this is in the 50s, and he said, we who live in this society today owe our way of looking at the world to 3 sources: the Greeks, the Romans, and the Hebrews. And I'll be very brief. He said the Greeks gave our way of thinking. The Romans gave us our way of administrating and organizing society. And the Hebrews, the Jews, gave us our understanding of community. And so out of that, he developed a whole expansion on the theme of modern society and its origins. I was impressed by this and didn't follow it further. And when I came across Steiner's work, I realized that this is a root, a notion of Steiner, that in history we are seeing developmental processes taking place. And that's vital for understanding it, for understanding philosophy as well. Of course, philosophy is not an easy task. If you look at some of the texts that are produced, they're pretty meaningless for many people who haven't acquired the academic concepts that philosophers use. And if you think of the huge social changes and political changes that have taken place in the 20th century, unbelievable, cataclysmic events, the extraordinary technology, the unimagined scientific explorations in all the natural sciences. Imagine at the end of the 19th century, we were just beginning to get the idea there might be a telephone. Now we've got the internet. We were going about in horse-drawn carriages. Now we go about in Airbus. The wealthy used to take trips to Italy from England. Now everybody can go everywhere by EasyJet. Dynamite was used to make the big tunnelings for the railway trains, but now we've got H-bombs. Yeah, there were 2 or 3 nations that dominated the world, European nations, or thought they did, in the end of the 19th century. Now there are 190 nations in the United Nations, all independent, believing themselves to be independent entities, independent national groups. Huge changes. Think of the ethnic cleansing, as it's called, that's been part of the 20th century. Think of the moonwalk, the death camps, Hiroshima, the personalities like Gandhi and Mandela, overpopulation of the earth, the desertification of the earth. You know, all these have suddenly come up in the 20th century as huge issues, questions, people. So the work of these philosophers we're going to talk about is not to analyze these social questions so much as to be influenced by the experience of the 20th century. They are open to it, and yet it's not their job to analyze it. Their job is to think, penetrate the human condition. And that's what their task is. And this is a task that's not very popular, the task of thinking. That, I believe, is their gift to the rest of us. Now, I want to begin with this philosopher who actually died in 1900. So what's he got to do with the 20th century? He was already ill and mentally collapsed in 1889. And his books had already been published, but mainly they became published after his death, and their whole influence has been on the 20th century. So we're going to start with Friedrich Nietzsche, because he, of all the 19th century philosophers, had a profound sense of what was coming. No other philosopher had anything like the intuition that this man had of what was just round the corner. For people living in England, also in continental Europe, in Germany, Italy, France, there were great prospects. Technology was going to provide us with all sorts of comforts and wonderful possibilities. Education was developing, democracy was the great thing, and so on. People looked forward to a wonderful 20th century. And then, of course, it all crashed with the Great War. Well, where's Nietzsche in this? He didn't, of course, experience the Great War, but he described how the 20th century would be a century of great wars. His most famous phrase, God is dead. Some years ago in the Tube in London, people used to put up little sayings that they liked, and so somebody put up a little poster on one of these sides of the Underground Railway, God is dead, Nietzsche. So a few weeks later, a new poster appeared, Nietzsche is dead, God. But what did he mean by God is dead? It comes up in a number of his writings. There's a madman going around the marketplace shouting, God is dead and you've killed him. God is dead, you've killed him. And why have they killed him? Because they have taken into themselves a way of the world in which God is not possible. Darwin had already published his work, which everybody was reading, and published it in 1859. Everybody had read that. The situation of man as a higher animal was clear to many thinking people. And so the arguments with religion were ferocious, and religion was on the back foot most of the time, trying to defend itself against this new dogmatic scientific view. And so all the source of your morality, your social conventions, your way of looking at the world, your art, all depended on the former belief that there was a God, and religion described the relationship of man to God. All that is disappearing. You've killed God. God is dead. And then the question is, all right, where are you going to get all your art from? Where are you going to get all your beliefs, your values? Where are they coming from? Do you know? So that's the message. God is dead. Nietzsche could see ahead a Europe without the guidance which had existed through all past centuries. What do you call the philistine? Everybody know the philistine? That's somebody who just believes in very conventional notions. The philistine, the mediocre, a slavish mentality, a rejection of all higher values, in spite of appearances, that rules the day. Nietzsche lived in the time of Bismarck, bringing Germany into a unification. He despised Bismarck, and he despised the new Germany, which had become bourgeois, conventional, nationalistic. He also foresaw, when I mentioned that there would be a century of great wars ahead. Now I'll say a little about who this man was. His father was a pastor of the Lutheran Church, so he was brought up in a very religious environment. But his father died when he was a young boy, about the age of 5, and he died a very painful death. It must have been cancer, I'm not sure, but a very painful death that lasted a year, and this little boy was seeing his father die and wondering what God is doing about this. And also his brother died in the same year, and that remained only his sister and himself. And so this was a profound shock to the young Nietzsche. Nevertheless, when he came to the time to go to university, he decided to study theology. And that was out of his background. That seemed to be the right way forward. But after a year or so, he had a shock. And he wrote to his sister how it was impossible for him to go to the Easter Mass. And then he changed his studies from theology to philology. Now, philology, we use that word, but the meaning of it in that time was basically the study of the classics, Greek and Roman, literature, philosophy, customs, and so on. And so he became a student of philology. And he was a very brilliant student. The region of Germany he comes from is Saxony. Got a vague idea, it's North Germany. And of course part of the Protestant region of Germany. And so he completed his studies, and then he was invited to be a professor at the age of 24. He was so brilliant, but he was invited in Switzerland to the University of Basel. And there he was, of course, under the influence of many of the great writers, but one of them particularly was a German philosopher, Schopenhauer, who greatly influenced Nietzsche. And Schopenhauer had a essentially pessimistic view of life. He was connected himself with Buddhism from a European point of view. And he had the conception that in order to understand life, you have to get away from it. Now, life has become so noisy, so disturbing, that you can only understand it if you go away into the forest or into the desert and think about it. Then you have to come back, of course. But the best place to be to understand it is outside life. And this was a little bit sympathetic for Nietzsche. He develops what he called a kind of asceticism. Now, asceticism we usually think of as a way of training yourself through difficult disciplines in a monastery or in the desert or something like that, like a person who's far away from the noise and hubbub of every day. And Nietzsche also asked himself, well, what is this ascetic process so that you can come to understand? And I'll talk a little about the stages he thought from this aspect of asceticism. The first book that he published, or one of the first books, was called The Birth of Tragedy Out of the Spirit of Music. A very strange book, but a very remarkable one. And the person who influenced him in the writing of this book was the great German musician, Wagner. And he was tremendously impressed by Wagner. You can imagine Wagner was beginning to create and Bayreuth, these extraordinary dramas, musical dramas, in which all the arts of music, painting, theatre were all combined. And it was very different from the operas that had been created before. And Nietzsche felt this is the spirit of the new age. This man is bringing together a new age in art. And his own studies of the Greek culture, Greek philosophy, Greek art and drama convinced him that what was at the essence of the Greek art was being revived through Wagner. For him, the essence of the Greek art is something like this. In all art, there are two aspects, two tendencies. One he called the Apollonian, from the god Apollo. Apollo is the god of the sun, the god of light. But he's also the god who incarnates clarity, balance, imagination. But there's another being, another tendency in the creation of art. And that was owed to the god Dionysus. And Dionysus is a much younger god than Apollo. And Dionysus is the source of what you might call orgiastic rites, totally the opposite of the Apollonian. In the Dionysian world, you give up the clarity of thinking. You immerse yourself into the will, into the dance, into music, into everything that takes you over. It's a kind of drunkenness, a kind of inebriation. And the Greeks described this in their plays, how the women used to go kind of mad, and they would run into the mountains, and the huge, extraordinary, orgiastic ceremonies would take place there, and even the god would be destroyed and dismembered. It's an extraordinary aspect. And for Nietzsche, this was one essential aspect of the artistic process. You have the Apollonian, balance, clarity, imagination, and then you have this will, dynamic, release of forces that you can hardly bear. And when it's all over, there's just exhaustion, nausea, and one's been somewhere and one doesn't quite know where one's been. But one comes back with some kind of illumination, something like that. And so these two tendencies are at work in Greek art. And here was Wagner recreating them, according to Nietzsche. So he writes this book, The Birth of Tragedy, and quite extraordinary insights into many aspects of art. And even today, I think one can see that in art there is still an understanding of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. In European art, if you think of the classical, what we call the classical in architecture, or in painting, or in sculpture, then people like Brunelleschi in Italy, the classical style, poised, balanced, clear, light-filled, all that, quite different from the Gothic. And then you think of, in painting, you think of the French Claude Lorraine, these beautiful landscapes, and then you think of the later Turner, who wanted to be as good as Claude Lorraine, with his turbulent sunsets and storms and so on, kind of classical romantic polarity. So a little bit touches on these tendencies, I think, of the Apollonian and the Dionysian. And so for Nietzsche, this was the secret of art. And Wagner had caught it. Well, it didn't work out too well, because Wagner became a pupil almost of Wagner. He visited his house, and they were close friends. Wagner was considerably older. And so Wagner had found a young disciple who was also a great writer. So the bond for the moment was very strong. And then the incident is described by Nietzsche. He went to the first performance of The Ring, and there he was, and Wagner could see his disciple was there. When the music started, he describes how he had a feeling of nausea. He could hardly bear it. He got up and walked out. That was the breach between Nietzsche and Wagner. They became bitter enemies, and later, when Wagner's dead, he writes a book on the case of Wagner. And now Nietzsche goes through another stage in his development. He turns from German, romantic, Wagnerian art and studies the French, and particularly the French skeptical writers like Voltaire and others, La Rochefoucauld and others, who take a rather aloof, skeptical, critical view of life. And everything that we think is acceptable, they'll penetrate it with some clever thinking and show it's just a facade. What is pity? You know what pity really is? And they'll turn it around and show that the people who want to be pitied are actually exercising a certain power. That's the really secret of pity. So watch out when you take pity on people. Sympathy and these things are traps. Watch out. Voltaire, that's very much the spirit. And one of the next books that Nietzsche produces is called Human All Too Human, and it's full of these, what I call, very critical and intellectually subtle penetrations of ordinary conventional attitudes which he begins to undermine. Human, all too human. It's only when we get to a strange creation of this man that we really get to the heart of what Nietzsche is about. It's called Thus Spake Zarathustra. It's a kind of poetic work, but it's not in rhymed. It's just the prose has a poetic quality to it. It's not rhymed poetry or anything like that. It is given as the teaching of a prophet called Zarathustra, who is Nietzsche. Zarathustra, however, was the great teacher of the Persians. He lived in the 6th century BC, about the time of Buddha. And even it's also claimed that Zarathustra was the name of a succession of initiates. And the last one was the one who lived in the 6th century. And he founded a great, or his predecessors, the great impulse of Iranian, Persian culture. To realize that Iranian culture that we have certain views about today from the West has an ancestry when Europe was, human beings were living like the ancient Britons, with skins around them and no art or architecture in the sense that was being created in Iran, back into the 6,000 years BC. Anyway, he chooses this name, Zarathustra. Zarathustra is interesting because he is the teacher of polarity. There are two beings in the world, the being of light and the being of darkness. Ahura Mazda is the being of light. Angrimanu or Ahriman in the Persian language is the being of darkness. She chooses this. And there, the book is called Thus Spake. So it's put in a kind of biblical language, as if it was a holy book. But it's anything but holy in the usual sense. And so spoke Zarathustra. This is his text. The prophet goes into the mountains. There in the mountains, up in the thin air of the mountains, or the ice, the cold, that's where you can think. But then he decides, now after all this thinking, I must take something to humanity. So he comes down from the mountain and meets humanity. And of course, he's pretty shocked by what he meets most of the time. And he tries to teach them, not to become my follower, but to become yourself. This is the great teaching. I'm not bringing anything to you. I'm bringing to you, if I bring anything, yourself, because you're not yourself. And so they go through they're all very short so-called chapters, about 30 or 40 of them, in which he picks up themes in a kind of symbolic language and offers them. And I'm just going to give you one or two. Well, the first one is God is dead. One of the first themes. God is dead. But I'll just read you just a verse from it. It's a part of a chapter, the end of a chapter. But when Zarathustra was alone, he spoke this within his heart. Can it be possible that he's met an old saint in the forest who's searching for God? And after he leaves the forest, he has this reflection. Can it indeed be possible? This old saint in his forest hasn't yet heard that God is dead. And then, when Zarathustra reached that city which lies nearest to the forest, he found there many people assembled in the marketplace. It was said that they should see a rope dancer. And Zarathustra spoke thus to the people. I teach you. Now, the German word is Übermensch, usually translated by Superman. But the Superman we get from Hollywood is a particular picture of Superman, which is not Übermensch. So I've translated it as Overman, not very comfortable in English. But I have to get away from our conventional film-induced concept of Superman. Overman. Emerson talks about the oversoul. So he's put that into the English language. And there is a relationship between Emerson's oversoul and Nietzsche's Übermensch. Maybe we should just leave it in German. And there's a rope dancer. I teach you the Übermensch. Man is a thing to be surmounted, to be gone beyond. Now again, the German language gives you something that the English language, there's Übergang and Untergang. Übergang, to go over, Untergang, to go under, but to decline. So you've got surmounting or going down. And the German word, gang, is in common to both. We don't have that in English. So you're surmounting or you're going the other way. And so I teach you the overman, the übermensch. Man is a thing to be surmounted. What have you done to surmount him, to go beyond him? All things hitherto have created something above themselves, like God. Will ye be able of this great tide, and rather, will ye be the ebb of this great tide, and rather revert to the beast than surmount man? In other words, and that's the Übergang and the Untergang. So you've got a choice now. The task of man is not to invent somebody higher than you, but to become higher, to surmount what we know as human. What is the ape to man? A jest or a thing of shame? So shall man be to the Übermensch. To the Übermensch will only be like the ape to man. A jest, a thing of shame. And then he goes on about the rope dancers. Man is a rope stretched between the beast and the Übermensch. A rope over an abyss. So that's Nietzsche's picture of the human being. A rope over an abyss. Could be talking today, couldn't he? Perilous is the crossing, perilous the way, perilous the backward look, perilous all trembling and halting by the way. Man is great in that he is a bridge and not a goal. Man can be loved in that he is a transition and a perishing. So he's going up, forward, and down. So, one could read whole chunks out of this. It's that kind of stuff. I just want you to get a feel for what this man is writing. And then he talks about the last man. The last man is the most contemptible of all things. The last man, that's the last of us. And he addresses him ironically. What can I say to these people who are all bits of the last man? So he talks ironically. And he says, it's time for man to mark the goal. Which is just the contradiction of what he said. We're not a goal, we're a bridge. But he's talking now to the last man. That's people who've not yet reached what he has to understand. It's time for man to mark his goal, to sow the seed of his highest hope. The day comes when man shall no longer shoot the arrow of his desire beyond man, when his bowstring shall have forgotten its use. He will no longer know love, creation, desire, or even a star. That's the last man. That's his condition. And now the man who surmounted man will know love, creation, and a star. That's it. Then he talks about spirit. Now for Nietzsche, spirit is not something separated from the human being. Spirit and body are one. There is no distinction. But he nevertheless understands spirit. He's not a materialist in that sense, but he doesn't have any idealistic separation of spirit is striving for something out there, and here's the poor flesh holding us back. Nothing like that in Nietzsche. Spirit is incarnated, yes, I'm embodied, better maybe, in the flesh. And that's it, that's what there is. And he said there are 3 stages. He says, this is a symbolism. He loves animals. The camel, the lion, and the child. The description of the camel is really, I suppose, this is the first stage of spirit. Well, you can imagine the camel. You know, it has to load itself up with water before it sets off in the desert, doesn't it? Loaded with burden, with weight, staggers, it tries to get up off its knees and then plunges forward. Many heavy burdens are there for the spirit. The strong spirit which is able to bear the load and in which reverence dwelleth. Its strength demandeth heavy and heaviest burden. And in a way, as it goes on, he describes his picture of how religion has looked at the spirit. You've got to suffer, you've got to be burdened, you've got to be poor, you've got to go through terrible trials, and then you will reach the spirit of the world. You will be blessed. Then you will reach the spirit. And that he sees as the tendency in the whole development of the church and theology until 19th century, when God is dead. So that's the camel experience. And then the lion. The lion is in the desert and it roars. That's Nietzsche. That's the spirit of Nietzsche, the spirit of Zarathustra. He's not the third stage, he can't get there. He's only at the intermediary stage. He's roaring against the camel's past experience, but he hasn't got the future. And so he describes the lion as, in this attitude of the desert where the camel is, there comes the second metamorphosis. There the spirit becomes a lion that seeks to seize freedom as his prey and to be Lord in his own desert. What a picture. To seize freedom as his prey and to be Lord in his own desert. You're on your own. And the third one is the child. The child is innocence and oblivion, a new beginning, a play, a self-rolling wheel, a primal motion, a holy yea-saying, saying yes. So you've got the three stages. The burdened Christian, lashing themselves in the monasteries and so on, burdened with sin. If you read St. John of the Cross or the great saints, how they were burdened. And then the lion, alone in the desert, freedom its prey. And then the child, yea-saying, innocent, forward-looking. That's the metamorphosis of the spirit. There's a little quote from the same book. The eye speaks of the body and always desires the body, even if it makes poetry. The contemporary, Rilke, writes very similarly. He wants to write where all he writes is not of a world beyond, but of this here and now, the experience of the senses of the body in which the spirit is penetrating. And Nietzsche is already saying this before Rilke. And the healthy speaks of the meaning of the earth. Not the earth is to be overcome, we just have to go through this dark stage and then we've got the light and the meaning of the world is in heaven. No, no. For the healthy spirit, for Nietzsche, the meaning is in the earth. That's what we're facing today, isn't it? Now, one of his great themes is the will to power. And of course, that's been interpreted in many ways. What does he mean by the will to power? He writes much about this, and you can see that it's connected with this idea of the Superman, the Overman, the Übermensch. This personality, who's got the will to power, is one who creates his own goals. He doesn't look for other outside himself for his goal. He finds within himself his aim. The weak personality, who doesn't have this will to power, is obedient to an authority. And that authority can be the Bible, the Quran, the Buddha text, the divine will, what the priests say, the New Testament, whatever. Or even the voice of conscience. You're obedient to something that's actually really external to the real center of the self. And so what the authority says, yes, is considered good by such people, the weak personalities, and what the authority says is no to, that must be bad. But the strong person looks for his life task in working out his own creative self. The weak people preach selflessness as the highest value, the consequence of their lack of creative power. The strong loves war because he needs to manifest his creativity in opposition to powers hostile to him. The creative acts without mercy and is indifferent to those who oppose him. He has no sympathy for those who suffer. Schopenhauer, who described the whole world as a kind of hospital, and actions arising out of sympathy for suffering should be considered the highest virtue. Sympathy, however, for Nietzsche, weakens power, courage, bravery. These are the virtues. Christian morality is the morality of slaves. The action of the victorious individual in society are good. Those of others, evil. Human actions are outstreaming of instincts, and these differ according to each individual. So Nietzsche had no interest in democratic ideals of equal rights and equal responsibilities and so on. History always belongs to the strong, the creative, not to the weak and the uncreative. Health, spirit, beauty, perseverance, courage, nobility. These are the values which are more significant than suffering, weakness, sympathy, and so on. Those are the happy qualities which have to be willed. This is the Übermensch. The Christ represents the weak, dying, suffering, beaten Christ represents the opposite. Well, you can see the dangers of this kind of philosophy and how it goes in Europe and how the racists take it up, especially in Germany. The text becomes a kind of Bible for the Nazis, for the National Socialists, and you can see where it comes from. Well, I think it's quite clear that from all the rest of the things that Nietzsche has written, that he was no racist. He was not talking about a racial superiority. He was talking about something quite different. And he was trying to analyze all these negative elements that were so deep in 19th century society that we believe we treat a kind of metaphysical or religious world as more real than the world we're actually living in. And there's the world we have to be in if we're going to become what we have to become. Otherwise, it's only decline. Everything will only be decline. And the way it was taken up by the Nazis, of course, has got its own history, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. But this question of him talking about, you see, he had no time for Socrates, who teaches the Greeks thinking. For him, the human being works out of a kind of instincts, a series of instincts. Not only the instinct for self-preservation and for nourishment and so on, these bodily instincts, but the instinct for knowledge. That's an instinct with Nietzsche. The instinct for even morality is an instinct, but not just an obedient morality. An instinct for finding one's own goals, which have, for him also, moral content. Although it seems as if it only looks as if it's pure, sheer, selfish individualism. He's engaged in having to expose what he sees as the real destructive elements in the society that surrounds him. And in doing that, he puts himself in another position which makes him open to the criticism that he's actually preparing the way for the kind of dictatorships and tyrannical ethnic cleansing and everything of one race being superior to another and so on. You know, we hear Karadzic talking about the wonderful Serbs and these terrible Bosnians and so on. It's all today, you know, and this has been taken up as if it were a Nietzschean theme. But I think his Übermensch is not really this individual, the marching, jackbooted brown shirt is not his Übermensch by any means. It's quite clear he was no anti-Semite, and there were many anti-Semites in Germany at the time. And that wasn't part of him. Now, time runs out. He wrote other books following Zarathustra. Essentially, he's talking about how can one envisage a new morality. One of his books is significantly called Beyond Good and Evil. If good and evil are merely what the divine authority tells you is good, it says yes to, then it must be good. And if the divine authority says that's not good, it's in the Bible, that must be bad. If you're still living in that world, we have to go beyond it, beyond good and evil. And we have to found a new basis for morality. And that new basis is actually on this capacity and this will to go beyond, to surmount. So in many ways, he turns around the same theme of the movement from this existing, essentially decadent European to a new kind of spirituality, a new kind of human being. As a personality, I've described how his Zarathustra loved the mountains and the cold wind and the air. And that's where Nietzsche felt he belonged. For a time he lived in the Alps. He loved that. He gave up his professorship very soon, after a few years. He became quite ill and describes the terrible suffering he went through, pain and agony in his 30s. And he said, in the height of my suffering, my thinking became clearest. Then I could see the whole world that I'm looking at with the greatest clarity. He doesn't preach suffering, but he says, that's what happened to me. I went through this agonizing, sometimes I could hardly get up for weeks, and he suffered like that. And yet at that time, that's when I was founding my deepest penetrating thoughts about contemporary life. One of his phrases is, if you gaze for long into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you. Steiner wrote about Nietzsche and actually went to see him when he was no longer able to communicate. He just lay in his bed and stared. And Steiner went and looked at this man. And he was introduced by Nietzsche's sister, Elizabeth, who married a gentleman called Förster, so her name is Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche. The husband determined to go and set up in South America an enclave, a society of pure German, Nueva Germania, New Germany, in Paraguay. And it was mainly the husband's impulse. He was a very strong anti-Semite, very strong racist. And this society actually apparently still exists. But he died quite soon. And then his sister came back when Nietzsche had already collapsed. The moment of his collapse was interesting. He was in Turin, I think, in Italy, Torino. And he was walking and he saw a man taking a horse with a horse and cart coming along the street. And this man was lashing the horse, beat it, and then the horse fell on its knees. And Nietzsche went up and put his arms around the horse's head in sympathy, and then he phased out. He never spoke a single word after that. He was carried off to an asylum. And then eventually back to his home, and then his sister set up a home for him and looked after him until he died after 10 years of this madness. Not mad in that he was running around, madness that just total silence surrounded this man. But Steiner, though, went to see him, and he wrote this, he actually wrote a book about him and calls him a fighter for freedom. So, he's seeing a very different picture from what the Nazis saw. And I'll just give you a little quote. Nietzsche is an anti-idealist in the sense in which the modern natural scientist opposes the assumption of purposes which nature is to bring about. The normal approach was that nature is there, if you read the medieval literature, there is a purpose which God has designed for it, and that's what nature is. And science says, no, there are no such purposes in nature. And of course, this is Darwinism, but also widespread in European. And Nietzsche, equally, is opposed to any form of idealism. He speaks as little about moral purposes as the scientist about moral purposes. He doesn't say, this is what you should do. It's always from the inner sense of where one is that has to act, not out of an indication that comes externally. Nature doesn't consider it wiser to say man should bring about a moral ideal than to explain the bull horns that he can go with them. Well, that's a famous image that comes in the philosophy. Does the bull develop its horns in order to butt, or do the horns develop and then the bull butts? Which comes first? Nietzsche considers the one as well as the other expression to be a product of a world explanation which speaks about divine providence and wise omnipotence instead of natural causes. The world clarification is a check to all sound thinking. This is what Steiner is saying about Nietzsche's approach. Nietzsche's getting rid of a lot of stuff that's leading to false thinking. That's what he's doing. Pay attention to that. The false thinking that we are surrounded by produces a fictitious fog of ideals which prevents the natural power of seeing, orientated to the observation of reality, that ability to fathom world events. Finally, it completely dulls all reality. Now, this is Steiner talking, and he's seeing this in Nietzsche, and he says, this is what Steiner said, we've got to get rid of all these false ideals if we want to see reality. We've got to start with reality, not some wonderful ideal that we impose on so-called reality. Steiner. Later, just a few years before he lost his full consciousness, he wrote a book called Ecce Homo, Behold the Man, which is the words in the Bible when Christ appears before the crowd, and they ask him, do you want Barabbas or do you want Christ? And they want to crucify Christ. Ecce Homo, that's the Latin, Behold the Man. And he writes a book called Behold the Man, Ecce Homo. And in it, he has the chapter says, Why I am so wise. Okay, do you want to know why I'm so wise? You want to know why to be wise? Okay, I'll tell you. The fortunateness of my existence, its uniqueness perhaps, lies in its fatality. Just what happened to me. To express it in the form of a riddle. As my father, I have died. Remember, his father did die when he was 5. As my father, I have died. I have already died. As my mother, I still live and grow. This twofold origin, as it were, from the highest and the lowest rung of the ladder of life, at once decadence and beginning. The father represents the dying, the decadent. The mother represents the growing, the beginning. This, if anything, explains that neutrality, that freedom from party in relation to the total problem of life, which perhaps distinguishes me. I have a subtler sense for signs of ascent and decline than any man ever had. So he's got a nose for the decadent, but also an eye for the ascent. That's where he lives. I think that expresses him very well. Now, one last thing I want to say to you. One last thing. He says some terrible things about Christianity. You'd think this man must be the most violent critic of Christianity ever born. He talked about priests being vile lice and all sorts of things, and God is dead, of course, and so on. And there's an interesting book written by another German philosopher called Karl Jaspers, who lived a little later. We didn't know Nietzsche, but he studied him, and he looked at this question of what is the real relationship of Nietzsche with Christianity. I just want to end on that, because the two themes in the modern 20th century that have been especially taken up by contemporaries is the death of God, religion is finished, and the other one, the anti-Christian theme. Christianity is a joke, a jest. And Jaspers looks at this. I just want to say something about that, and then we'll finish. From Jaspers' point of view, Nietzsche has described to us civilization sunk to its lowest level. Christianity is at the origin of this crisis. Culture no longer exists, just information. No longer is there any real substance, just pretense. Drunkenness and sensationalism divert us from boredom. This is Jaspers' reading of Nietzsche. Then Nietzsche proceeds to castigate, to punish, and to criticize Christianity and its representatives, priests, ministers, popes, churches, and so on. All its values come to nothing. Behind the whole facade is nihilism. God is dead because of Christianity. For Nietzsche, Jesus is separate from the historical development of Christianity. Jaspers makes the case that the ultimate search for Nietzsche is the fulfillment of Christianity, not the continuation of what is called Christianity. and it must be non-dogmatic experience, reach out of inner freedom of one who understands the Übermensch, the overcoming of the ordinary. Nietzsche sees history as a process of the transformation of humanity. The stage reached in the 19th century Europe has come to an end. A new chapter has to begin. His work is to help forge this new human being. Nihilism is a stage on the way. When Jesus embodied a way of life, the church turned it into a belief. This is a denial of Christianity. Only to emphasize the nihilism and the anti-Christian preaching of Nietzsche is to fail to recognize him as an analyst of decadence, but also as one who tried to find a way forward. In this, he was well ahead of his contemporaries, and that is why he speaks to our age today so powerfully. More than any other philosopher of modern times, Nietzsche is not so much an object of scholarship as a mirror of self-reflection and a probe for self-identity.
The next episode is on Martin Heidegger.